That evening, when my daughter-in-law, Kate, dropped off my 5-year-old granddaughter, Alice, for one night, I never imagined what was about to unfold. I had just finished preparing dinner and was sitting in the kitchen, quietly sipping my tea, when I heard her tiny footsteps shuffle into the room. Alice's big, curious eyes locked with mine, and she walked up to me, her little voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma, Mommy told me not to tell you what I saw at home." In that moment my heart stopped. There was something about the way she said it, the secrecy in her tone, that sent a chill down my spine. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. This was not just the innocent, carefree chatter of a little girl. I could see it in her face. Something had happened. Something serious. I put down my tea, my hands shaking, and I gently took Alice's small, trembling hand in mine. My voice, though quiet, was firm. "Sweetheart, what did you see?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. "Mommy told me not to tell you, Grandma. But there's a girl. In the basement, she was crying and saying her hands hurt." The words hit me like a slap in the face. I froze. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what my granddaughter had just revealed to me. I glanced at Alice, then back at the kitchen door, and for the briefest of moments I considered ignoring it. But the dread in my gut told me that ignoring it wasn't an option. Without another thought, I reached for the phone. There was no time to waste. I called the police. If you want to hear my story until the end, please subscribe to the channel. Write which city you're listening from and keep listening. I'm Lucia, 63 years old. I've lived a life that most would call simple, but it's been anything but easy. My days have been filled with the steady rhythm of family. I've raised 2 sons, always with the hope that they would grow into men who would carry on the values I worked so hard to instill in them: love, respect, and loyalty. And then there's my grandchildren, Alice, the youngest, the one who still looks at the world with wide eyes full of wonder and innocence. For as long as I can remember, my life has been a constant cycle of care and giving. I was always the one they turned to for help. My sons, now grown with families of their own, knew that they could rely on me for anything. And Kate, my daughter-in-law, she was no different. When my son married her, I welcomed her into the family with open arms. She was a young woman, a little unsure at first, but over time I came to love her like a daughter. I supported her through the ups and downs, through the challenges of motherhood, always trying to ease the burden she carried. I was proud of the role I played in their lives. Proud to be the pillar of the family, the one everyone could lean on. But that pride was about to be tested in a way I never could have imagined. Now, sitting at my kitchen table, holding this letter, my world feels like it's been turned upside down. How did we get here? How did I go from being the trusted matriarch, the rock, to someone who was betrayed in the worst way possible? I've spent years building this family, shaping it with my own hands, my love, and my sacrifices. But now, as I read these words, I feel the weight of something darker. Something hidden from me for far too long. How could my own children, my flesh and blood, turn on me like this? How could they do this to me after everything I've done for them? The letter was from the police. It outlined what had been discovered in Kate's house, what Alice had witnessed in the basement. The child locked away, the pain, the suffering. I could hardly breathe as I read it, my hands trembling. This was not the family I had built. This was something entirely different, something monstrous. I felt a sudden wave of bitterness wash over me. How could Kate do this to her own child? How could she hide something like this from me? I thought I knew her better than anyone. I trusted her. I supported her. But now everything felt like a lie. The foundation of our relationship, built on years of trust and mutual respect, had crumbled in an instant. I stared at the letter in my hands, my thoughts swirling. It wasn't just Kate I felt betrayed by. It was the entire family. The people I had given everything to, the people I had trusted with my heart, had kept something from me so vile, so unforgivable, that I couldn't begin to process it. The shock and outrage from Alice's revelation were still fresh in my mind. But now, as I sat there trying to piece together the events of the past months, another emotion began to take hold. Something cold and bitter. Something that told me I was no longer the woman who would always be there to help, to support. No, now I was the one who had been left in the dark. I had been kept out of the loop, made to feel like an outsider in my own family. And that feeling, that betrayal, was worse than any physical pain I could imagine. How had it come to this? How had Kate, the woman I had taken in as my own, turned into someone I couldn't recognize. How had my family become this fractured, this divided? The answers felt elusive, slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I tried to grasp them. I had always been proud of my family, proud of the life we had built together. But now I felt like a fool. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs? And worse, how could I ever face them again after this? It's funny how, when you look back on things, the cracks were always there, hiding in plain sight. At first, I brushed them off. I was too focused on my family's well-being, on making sure everyone had what they needed. But now, as I reflect on everything that has unfolded, I can see the warning signs. They were there all along, buried under the surface, waiting for me to notice. It all started a few months ago. Kate came to me with a request. She was struggling financially, as she had been for a while. She told me she needed some money to get back on track, to help pay some bills, to ease the stress that was weighing on her and my son Mark. I could see the worry in her eyes, and I didn't hesitate. I reached into my savings and gave her a large sum of money, without a second thought. I didn't question her, I trusted her. After all, she was family. She was my daughter-in-law, and my role in the family was to support them however I could. For weeks, I didn't hear much about how things were going. It wasn't unusual for Kate to be a little distant when things were tough, so I didn't think much of it. But one day, after I had dropped by their house to check in on Alice, I decided to ask Kate how things were going with the money I had given her. I remember that conversation as though it happened yesterday. "Kate, how's everything going? Are you getting things back on track?" I had asked, trying to sound casual, though I was feeling a little uneasy. Her response was quick, almost too quick. She looked away, fiddling with her fingers. "Oh, Mom, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. We're good." But I noticed it, the way she avoided my gaze, the way she shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't like her. Kate had always been open with me, never afraid to speak her mind or ask for help when she needed it. But now she was distant, almost closed off, like she was hiding something. I brushed it off at the time. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, we all go through tough times, don't we? But that feeling, that nagging sense that something was off, stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Something in the air felt different, heavier. But I didn't press her. I didn't want to intrude or make her feel uncomfortable, so I let it go. But that was the first crack. The first sign that something wasn't right. Kate's sudden detachment, her refusal to talk openly with me about what was going on. It wasn't normal. In the weeks that followed, things only got worse. Kate's distance became more pronounced. She started rejecting my help more often, even when I offered to watch Alice for a few hours or help with errands. She had always been quick to ask for help in the past, but now it seemed like she wanted to handle everything on her own. When I did spend time with Alice, it felt like I was being kept at arm's length, like there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. I began to notice small, subtle changes in her behavior. Her voice was more curt, her smile less genuine. The warmth that had once been there, the connection we shared, was slowly slipping away. And the more I tried to reach out to her, the more she pulled away. At first, I convinced myself that she was just stressed, that it was a phase. After all, life was complicated. Raising a child, managing a household, dealing with the financial strain, it had to be overwhelming. I understood that. But the coldness, the indifference, it wasn't just stress. It felt like something deeper, something that couldn't be explained away. And then there was the other thing, the thing that haunted me in the back of my mind. I had caught a glimpse of it during one of my visits to their house. I wasn't snooping, but I had seen it briefly, just for a moment, something that didn't sit right. A door that had been left ajar, the sound of something muffled, almost like a whisper. I had thought it was nothing. But now, looking back, I couldn't help but wonder if that was the moment when everything changed. It was hard to admit to myself, but the truth was clear. Kate wasn't the same. Something had shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew deep down that things weren't as they should be. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel the unease building within me. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Not my sons. Not my friends. There was no one I could confide in. If I were to tell someone that I felt something was wrong with Kate, they'd think I was being paranoid, overreacting. And so, I kept it to myself, quietly suffering in silence, watching the woman I had once trusted begin to slip away from me. I began to question everything. Had I misjudged her all along? Had I been blind to the signs? And if I had been, what else was I missing? I started to second-guess myself, wondering if my own instincts were failing me. But it wasn't until Alice's confession that I truly understood the gravity of the situation. That was the moment I realized everything had changed. Everything that had been hidden, everything I had been blind to, was about to come crashing down on me. The days that followed Alice's revelation felt like they were suspended in time. Every moment, every interaction with Kate, felt like it carried the weight of that one confession. The little girl locked in the basement, crying with her hands hurting. It was as if Alice's words had shattered the fragile shell of normalcy we had all been living under. In the wake of that night, I couldn't look at Kate the same way. I couldn't ignore the icy distance that had crept between us. Kate was avoiding me more than ever. The warmth that had once filled our conversations, our interactions, was now replaced by a chilling coldness. She became more distant, her visits shorter, her words sharper, and I began to feel like I was no longer a part of her life in the way I once had been. It wasn't just the lack of communication. It was the subtle way she kept pulling away. It was the way she avoided making eye contact, the way her smiles didn't reach her eyes. I had always prided myself on being able to read people. It was a skill that came naturally to me, a product of years of caring for others, of nurturing my family. But now I found myself questioning my own perception. Was I reading too much into things? Or was there truly something wrong? The guilt began to gnaw at me. I should have acted sooner. I should have asked the right questions, noticed the signs, done something before it got this far. But I didn't. I had let it slip by, letting Kate's distance slide under the radar, because I didn't want to confront the possibility that something was deeply wrong. I was afraid of what I might find, afraid of what the truth might mean. But the truth had a way of revealing itself when you least expected it, didn't it? Every time I called Kate, she seemed to be too busy to talk. She would brush me off with vague answers or excuse herself from the conversation, as if she couldn't get off the phone fast enough. When I suggested spending time with Alice, she would hesitate, always finding a reason why she couldn't bring her over. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The cracks in our relationship were growing wider. It wasn't just the phone calls or the visits that were different. It was the way Kate would avoid talking about Alice, as if she were trying to keep something from me. When I asked about how Alice was doing, Kate would answer with a quick, "She's fine, don't worry." But I could see it in her face, in the tightness around her eyes, that there was more she wasn't telling me. At the same time, I noticed Alice becoming more withdrawn. She wasn't the same bubbly, curious child I had always known. She had started to act more timid, her laughter quieter, her voice softer. I didn't need a child psychologist to tell me that something was wrong. The signs were all there. Alice was hurting and I had no idea how to help her. I kept trying to reach out to Kate, but the wall between us had become too high to climb. The tension was palpable. It wasn't just in the way she avoided me. It was in the way she shut down every attempt I made to connect with her. It felt like she was shutting me out on purpose, like she didn't want me to know the truth. And I couldn't help but wonder, was she protecting herself? Or was she protecting something else? One evening, I decided to visit her house unannounced. It wasn't something I usually did, but I needed to see for myself what was going on. I needed to understand why everything felt so off. As I pulled up to their driveway, I noticed the house was darker than usual. There were no lights on in the windows, and the yard was strangely quiet. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I being paranoid? Maybe Kate was just having a rough day. Maybe she was tired and needed some space. But deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of unease that had been building for weeks. I rang the doorbell, my hand trembling slightly. Kate answered, her expression immediately closed off. She barely made eye contact, and I could see the unease in her posture. "Hi, Mom," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been worried about you. About Alice. Is everything okay?" Her response was quick, almost too quick. "Everything's fine. Alice is in bed and I'm just tired. I really don't have time to chat right now." It wasn't like her to brush me off like that. The tension in the air was so thick I could practically cut it with a knife. I wanted to push further to ask what was really going on, but something in her expression told me that it wasn't the right time. I left the house feeling more uncertain than ever. But as I drove home that night, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. Something was wrong. And it was time to face the truth. The realization that something had gone terribly wrong hit me with the force of a thunderclap. I had suspected it, felt it deep within me, but I never truly imagined it could be as horrific as what I was about to uncover. The betrayal was worse than I had anticipated, worse than I had feared. It was late one evening when Alice came to me again. The sun had already set, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my tea in silence, when I heard her small footsteps approach. Her face, as always, was a picture of innocence, but something was different this time. She was quieter, more subdued than usual. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I looked up, setting my cup aside. "Yes, sweetheart." I beckoned her closer, my heart already in my throat. There was a look on her face, a kind of hesitation, like she wasn't sure whether she should speak or not. She stood there for a moment, twisting her fingers in a nervous gesture. I reached out and patted the seat next to me, urging her to come closer. She climbed into the chair, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. It was as if both of us were waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, Alice spoke. "Grandma, Mommy told me not to tell you what I saw at home, but I think you need to know." My stomach dropped. This was it. The moment I had been dreading and yet somehow had always known would come. I tried to remain calm, my voice gentle but firm. "What did you see, Alice? You can tell me anything." She hesitated, biting her lip, as if weighing her words carefully. "There's a little girl, a baby. She's locked in the basement. And she cries. She says her hands hurt, Grandma. Her hands hurt really bad." The words hung in the air, the room spinning around me. A wave of nausea hit me, and for a moment, I felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. I blinked, trying to process what Alice had just said. This wasn't just some child's imagination. This was real. This was something far darker than I could have ever anticipated. I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. A child locked away in a basement, crying in pain. How could this be happening right under my nose? How could Kate, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had trusted and loved like a daughter, be involved in something so monstrous? My mind screamed in disbelief. This was not the woman I had known. This was not the family I had built with my own hands. I didn't know what to say, what to do. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. Without thinking, I dialed the police. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to report a crime. There's a child in danger. She's locked in a basement and she's hurt." I gave them the details as best as I could, my voice still shaky. I wasn't sure if I was making sense or not. My thoughts were scattered, spinning out of control, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't let that poor child suffer any longer. My heart ached for her, for the pain she must have been enduring in silence. When the police arrived, they took my statement, asked me questions, and then assured me that they would investigate. I could feel the weight of what I had just done pressing on my chest. My hands were still trembling as I hung up the phone. But deep down I knew I had done the right thing. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much this betrayal cut to the bone, I had to act. I had to protect that little girl. But what about Kate? What about my family? How could I ever look her in the eye again after this? How could I possibly face her when I knew the truth? The pain of that thought was almost unbearable. Kate had been my family, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had always thought of as my own. But now I had to accept the terrible truth. She had been hiding something from me. She had been part of something unimaginable, something I could never have fathomed in a million years. How could I have been so blind? How had I missed the signs? My mind raced with questions, with anger, with confusion. How could she have done this? How could she have allowed this to happen, to be part of it? Was she the one who had locked that child away? Was she the one who had caused her pain? Or was there someone else involved? Someone even darker lurking in the shadows? I didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The family I had loved, the family I had fought for, was not the same anymore. It was no longer a place of love and trust. It had become a place of secrets, of lies, of betrayal. As I sat there with Alice in my arms, I realized that I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't let my family's darkness destroy me. I couldn't stay silent while there was a child in pain, a child who needed my help. I had to act. I had to fight for what was right, even if it meant tearing apart the family I had once known. I looked down at Alice, who was snuggling close to me, her small body trembling with fear. She was scared. She had seen something that no child should ever have to see. And I promised her in that moment that I would protect her. I would protect her from the nightmare that had taken root in her own home. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I was no longer the passive observer in my family's story. This was my fight now, and I was going to win it. The night dragged on, the weight of everything pressing heavily on my chest. My hands were still trembling from the call to the police, and the silence in the house was suffocating. Alice had fallen asleep in my arms, her tiny frame exhausted from the emotion she had been carrying for who knows how long. But as I sat there holding her, I couldn't bring myself to rest. I knew that everything had changed in an instant, and I couldn't pretend anymore. The shock of Alice's confession, the cruel revelation that Kate had been hiding something so terrible, was only the beginning. The anger surged through me in waves, but there was something else, something colder and more frightening. It was a quiet clarity that settled into my bones. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you've reached the point of no return. The moment when you understand that the path ahead is one you can no longer avoid. I looked down at Alice, her soft breathing calming me for a moment, and then I took a deep breath. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about something far more important. It was about that little girl in the basement locked away in pain. It was about justice. And above all, it was about doing what was right. I could feel the rage, the helplessness, and the betrayal surging through me. But beneath it all was a sense of cold, unyielding determination. I had spent my life protecting my family, shielding them from harm, but now I had to protect them from something far worse, the darkness that had festered within my own home. Could I have prevented this? Could I have seen the signs sooner? 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but I forced myself to stop. There was no use in second-guessing. The truth had come to light, and now there was only one path forward. I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't ignore the suffering that was happening just beneath the surface. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing as I thought of the child locked away, in pain with no one to turn to. My heart broke at the thought of it. How had Kate been able to do this? How had she concealed such a monstrous secret? Was she afraid? Was she complicit? My head throbbed with questions that had no answers. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let this continue. I wasn't going to stand by while my family was caught up in something so horrific. The bond one had with Kate, with all of them, had been built on trust. And now that trust was shattered. It had been replaced by something darker, something I couldn't ignore. As I sat there with Alice nestled against me, I realized that I had a responsibility. It wasn't just a responsibility to my family, but to that little girl, to Alice, and to every child who had ever suffered in silence. I could no longer be a passive observer. I had to take action. I had to be the one to step forward to protect them, even if it meant tearing my family apart. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I had to face the truth no matter how much it hurt. I had spent my life caring for my family, putting them first, but now I had to do something for myself. I had to fight for what was right no matter the cost. The quiet clarity that had settled over me was a stark contrast to the confusion and anger that had preceded it. I no longer felt lost in the storm of emotions that had consumed me. I knew what I had to do. I had to go to the police. I had to make sure that that poor child, the one Alice had seen locked in the basement, was rescued. I had to bring this nightmare to light, no matter what it meant for my family. But as I looked down at Alice, my heart ached. How could I explain this to her? How could I tell her that her own mother had been involved in something so terrible? I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how to fix this. But I knew that I couldn't back down now. The weight of the decision was immense. I had to make sure the truth came out no matter how painful. But the cost of that truth would be high. Kate would be arrested, her life would be ruined. My family would never be the same. I had spent my entire life building a life for them, a life filled with love and trust, and now it was all unraveling before my eyes. But even as the pain of the betrayal threatened to overwhelm me, I realized that I couldn't let fear stop me. I couldn't let my own grief prevent me from doing what needed to be done. The child in the basement, Alice, and every other child who had ever been abused, those were the ones I needed to fight for. I took one last deep breath, holding Alice close to me. I could feel the weight of the world pressing down on me, but I wasn't going to back down. This was my fight now. It wasn't about what I had lost or what I stood to lose. It was about doing what was right. And no matter what it cost, I was going to see this through. I gently set Alice down in her bed, kissed her on the forehead, and stood up. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. It was time to face the truth, to bring the darkness into the light. And no matter how much it hurt, I was going to fight for justice, for that little girl in the basement, and for Alice, and for the future I had to protect. The next morning felt like a blur. It was as if time had suddenly accelerated, propelling me forward, pushing me into a future I hadn't prepared for. I woke up with the weight of the world pressing heavily on my chest, but I knew there was no time to waste. I couldn't afford to delay this any longer. I couldn't let that little girl continue to suffer, trapped in that basement with no one to turn to. I had already made up my mind, but the enormity of the decision still left me shaken. I had to go to the police, lay everything bare, and hope that they would act swiftly. This wasn't just a matter of family betrayal anymore. It was a matter of justice, of saving a life. And that made all the difference. I didn't wait for anyone. I didn't try to contact Kate, didn't try to reach out to Mark. There was no time for explanations, no time for second-guessing. This wasn't about trying to salvage relationships or fix what had been broken. This was about doing what was right no matter the cost. I had to act now, before the truth was buried any deeper. I dressed quickly, my hands still shaking with nerves, but also with something else, something stronger. Something that told me I couldn't turn back. I was ready. I had to be. I grabbed the papers I had carefully saved over the years, the ones that would show everything, the gifts, the support, the sacrifices I had made for my family. It was strange in a way to think of them now. They seemed so insignificant, these things I had done out of love, out of care. But now they felt like evidence. Evidence of the person I had been. Evidence of the trust that had been betrayed. As I walked to the car, my mind raced. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't let that stop me. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I had a duty not just to Alice, but to every child who had ever been hurt or ignored. This was bigger than me. It was bigger than Kate. It was about the future, and that was all that mattered now. When I arrived at the police station, I felt like I was walking through a fog. My feet seemed heavy, and the air felt thick, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on me. But when I walked through those doors, I knew there was no turning back. I had to do this for Alice, for that little girl in the basement, and for my family, even though I wasn't sure I could ever look them in the eye again. I approached the desk where a uniformed officer sat. His expression was neutral, but I could see the fatigue in his eyes. It was a look I recognized, one that spoke of long hours and hard cases. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke. "I need to file a report," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It's about my daughter-in-law. She's hiding a child in her basement. The child is in pain. I think she's been locked away for a long time." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We walked to a small office, and I could feel the intensity of the moment settling in, each step bringing me closer to the truth I couldn't avoid. When we sat down, I explained everything, what Alice had told me, the details I had gathered, my suspicions about Kate. I gave them everything I had. The records, the letters, the small pieces of evidence that I had held onto for so long. I told them about the financial issues Kate had faced, about the way she had withdrawn from me, and the way her behavior had changed in the last few months. I told them everything, even though every word felt like a betrayal. I had to get it out, had to make sure they understood the gravity of the situation. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he looked at me with a somber expression. "We'll take it from here," he said, his voice steady. "We'll investigate this. You did the right thing coming forward." The words, though comforting, didn't take away the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I still couldn't believe what I was doing. I had just handed over my own flesh and blood to the authorities. Kate was my daughter-in-law. She had been a part of our family for years. But now, she was the one being investigated. The woman I had once trusted, the woman who had been so much a part of my life, was the one I was exposing. And as much as I knew it was the right thing to do, I couldn't shake the pain of it. But I had to keep reminding myself, this wasn't just about Kate. This was about the child who had been locked away, suffering in silence. This was about Alice, about making sure she was safe from whatever horrors had been taking place in that house. I had to push through the pain, had to stay focused on what was important. The officer reassured me that they would investigate immediately. They would visit Kate's house, search for any evidence, and speak with Alice if necessary. I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. I wanted to ask if they would act quickly, but I didn't need to. I knew they would. They had no choice now. The truth had been laid out before them, and they couldn't turn back. As I left the police station, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, yes, but also fear. Fear of what would happen next, of how this would affect my family. Would Kate be arrested? Would Mark turn against me? Would I ever be able to forgive myself for what I had done? But I knew one thing. I had made the right choice. No matter the cost, I had to protect the vulnerable, even if it meant sacrificing everything I had worked for. Now the only thing left to do was wait. Wait for the investigation to unfold. Wait for justice to be served. And hope that somehow in the end this nightmare would finally come to an end. The days that followed were like a blur of anxious anticipation. I had done everything I could, filed the report, handed over the information, and left it in the hands of the police. The truth, raw and ugly, was out in the open. But with that truth came consequences, consequences I had never imagined, and certainly never prepared for. It wasn't long before the knock on the door came. I had just finished preparing dinner when I heard the loud, firm raps echoing through the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat. I knew exactly who it was. My hands trembled as I wiped them on my apron and walked cautiously toward the door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood before me, their expressions unreadable. "Lucia?" the older officer asked. "We need to talk to you about your daughter-in-law, Kate." My stomach twisted into knots. I stood frozen in place, not knowing what to expect. They didn't need to say anything more. I could see it in their eyes. This wasn't a routine visit. It wasn't just a matter of confirming information. No, something had already happened, and I was about to find out just how far the situation had escalated. "Is Kate here?" I managed to ask, my voice betraying the calm I was trying to project. "No, ma'am," the officer replied. "We've arrested her for the unlawful confinement of a child. We've found enough evidence to proceed with charges." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. Arrested? Kate, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had trusted, was being arrested. It felt unreal, like I had stepped into a nightmare. I could barely comprehend what the officer was saying. "You arrested her?" I repeated in a daze, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The words didn't seem to make sense. "Yes," the officer confirmed, his voice firm but understanding. "We received your report, and after further investigation, we've found the evidence of the child in the basement. We're proceeding with the case." I couldn't breathe. My hands shook, and for a moment, the room felt like it was closing in around me. I thought back to everything Kate had been to me, everything I had done for her, for my family. How had it come to this? How had the woman I had trusted so deeply fallen into something so twisted? The officer handed me a folder, containing the official charges and some of the preliminary evidence that had been uncovered during the investigation. I barely glanced at the papers. My mind was still reeling from the shock of hearing that Kate had been arrested. I had known on some level that this would be the outcome, but knowing it and seeing it unfold in front of me were 2 entirely different things. "Are you going to charge her with everything?" I asked, still struggling to come to terms with what was happening. The question was more for myself than for them. A desperate attempt to find clarity. The officer hesitated, and I saw a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "We've found the child. She's being treated, and we're making sure she gets the proper care. As for Kate, she will face the charges of unlawful confinement, endangering the welfare of a child, and possibly more as the investigation continues." My heart sank further. It was real. It was happening. And as much as I had known that the truth would eventually come to light, I wasn't prepared for the aftermath, for the destruction of everything that had once seemed solid. The officer continued, explaining the next steps in the legal process, but I barely heard him. My mind was a fog of disbelief and grief. Kate arrested for something so vile, so unforgivable. Mark's wife, the woman who had been a part of our family, a woman I had stood by through thick and thin, was now a criminal, a monster. How had I missed it? How had I not seen the warning signs sooner? In that moment I realized something else, something even more painful. My entire family was about to be torn apart. Kate's arrest would shatter everything. It would destroy any semblance of peace we had left. Mark would be devastated. Alice would be confused, lost in a world she couldn't understand. And how could I ever face them again, knowing I was the one who had exposed the truth? But no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't take it back. I couldn't undo what I had done. The truth was out. Kate had been hiding a nightmare in plain sight, and now there would be consequences. She would face justice. My family would face the fallout of her actions, no matter how difficult it would be for all of us. I sat down in the chair, the room spinning as I absorbed the magnitude of it all. The officers left soon after, assuring me that they would keep me updated on the investigation and any future developments. But I didn't hear their words. I only felt the hollow emptiness that had settled into my chest. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, the sense of betrayal so deep that it threatened to swallow me whole. Kate's arrest made the news. The charges were plastered on every headline, and soon the calls started coming in. Friends, family members, even distant acquaintances. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. How Kate could have done something so horrific. The questions were endless, but the answers were few. I had nothing to offer. No way to explain how the woman I had once loved and trusted had turned into someone capable of such evil. My heart ached for the child who had suffered, for Alice who had witnessed the horror, for my son Mark who had lost everything in a single moment. The family's reputation was shattered. People who had once supported Kate began to distance themselves. Unsure how to reconcile the woman they had known with the woman the police were now investigating. The walls of secrecy that had surrounded Kate for so long were finally crumbling, and everyone was forced to confront the ugly reality that had been hidden for too long. But through it all, there was a small part of me that felt something else, something I hadn't expected: justice. The truth was painful. The consequences were devastating. But the darkness had been exposed, and in the end, that was all I could ask for. Time passed slowly in the aftermath of Kate's arrest. The days blended together, filled with a quiet intensity as the police investigation continued. The court hearings proceeded, and my family slowly began to pick up the pieces of a life that had been irrevocably shattered. There were moments of silence in the house, long stretches of quiet where the weight of everything hung like a thick fog. I still found myself replaying the events in my head, everything that had happened, everything I had uncovered. I had acted, I had done what needed to be done, but it still felt like a raw wound that had yet to heal. Alice, though, seemed to be slowly finding her way back. The girl I had seen so scared, so fragile in those early days after everything came to light, was beginning to laugh again. It wasn't the same as before. There were still moments where her little face would cloud with confusion, with sadness, but the sparkle in her eyes was returning. She was healing, and that was the most important thing. I spent more time with her, taking her on walks, playing with her in the garden, doing anything to help her feel safe again. I felt like I was reclaiming a small piece of the family I had lost, even if it wasn't the same. But I wasn't just doing it for Alice, I was doing it for myself too. I needed something to hold on to in the aftermath of the storm. I needed to feel like I was still part of something, even if that something had changed beyond recognition. The house felt different now. It was quieter, emptier somehow, with fewer echoes of the past. It was as if the walls had absorbed the pain, the secrets and the lies, and were now standing still, waiting for something new to emerge. It was strange, almost unsettling. I had spent years building a life, creating a home for my family, and now I was left with an empty space where the warmth of love and trust had once been. But slowly, as the weeks passed, I started to see that the pain, though still present, wasn't as overwhelming as it had been. It was as if the weight of the betrayal had been lifted, even if only a little, and I could finally begin to breathe again. I had found my strength in the truth. And I had found something else too, my freedom. It wasn't just Alice who was healing, it was me too. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of relief, of clarity, of peace. It was as if the burden I had been carrying for so long had been lifted, and I could finally see the world with clearer eyes. I had fought for what was right, I had taken action when no one else would, and that gave me a sense of pride that I hadn't known in a long time. I started to rebuild my life bit by bit. I reached out to old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. I joined a local group, a place where I could share stories, laugh, and connect with others who had lived through their own struggles. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was doing something just for me. It wasn't about my family or their needs. It was about me finding my place again. Finding my own identity in the wreckage of everything that had come before. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I found myself sinking into the past, when the memories of Kate's betrayal and the pain of seeing my family broken seemed too much to bear. There were moments when I would think of Mark and wonder if we could ever repair the rift between us, if there was any way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by his wife's actions. But those moments were becoming fewer. I was learning to focus on what was within my control. My relationship with Alice, the steps I was taking to rebuild my own life, the choices I was making to ensure that I could find happiness again, even after everything that had happened. And then there were the small victories, the moments when Alice would look up at me with a smile, or when she would tell me about something she'd learned at school, her face lighting up with excitement. Those moments made everything worth it. They reminded me that, despite the pain, there was still hope, there was still love, and I could still create a future that was better, brighter, and full of the things that truly mattered. It wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself. It wasn't the family I had spent years building, but it was mine. And that was enough. It was enough to know that, no matter how broken everything had seemed, I had come through it stronger. I had come through it with a sense of dignity, with my integrity intact, and with the knowledge that I had done everything in my power to protect those I loved. I could look at Alice and know that I had made the right choice. She was my priority now. Her future was what mattered most to me. I had spent so many years putting my family first, sacrificing my own needs for their sake. But now I was learning how to put myself first. I was learning how to live for me. As time went on, I found a new sense of balance. It was strange, this new life I was creating for myself. But it was also beautiful. I found comfort in the routine, in the quiet moments with Alice, in the friendships I was building. I wasn't living in the past anymore. I was living in the present, and I was learning to embrace whatever the future held. I had weathered the storm, and now it was time for me to rebuild, to start fresh, to create a life that was my own. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly free. It was a quiet evening, the sun setting behind the trees, casting a warm golden glow across the horizon. Alice and I were walking along the park trail, her little hand wrapped around mine. She was laughing, her giggles echoing in the air. The kind of laughter that can only come from a child who feels safe again. As I watched her, a sense of peace settled over me. The storm had passed. The darkness had receded, and in its place there was light, soft, gentle, but enough to illuminate the path ahead. "Grandma, look," Alice said, pointing to a bird soaring overhead. "I think it's going to fly all the way to the clouds." I smiled, feeling my heart swell with love for this little girl. This bright soul who had endured more than anyone her age should. She had seen too much, but now she was starting to laugh again. She was starting to heal, and that meant everything to me. As we continued our walk, the weight of everything that had happened settled into a quiet understanding within me. Sometimes we have to fight not for what we lose, but for what we have left. I had fought for the truth, for justice, for Alice, and for my own peace. It hadn't been easy, and it had cost me more than I could have imagined. But in the end, I had found a new strength. I had found a new purpose. "Grandma," Alice said, tugging gently on my hand, "I'm happy." I looked down at her, my heart full. "I'm happy too, sweetheart," I replied softly. We stood there for a moment, the world around us growing quiet as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. I realized that though everything had changed, I had found something even more precious in the aftermath, peace. And in that peace I knew that I had won, not just for myself, but for Alice, and for everyone who had suffered because of the darkness I had exposed. This was my small victory. It may not have been grand or celebrated by anyone else, but it was mine. And that, I thought as I watched the sky darken, was enough.